I'm going to read through the story Disney's Cinderella. And when I find characteristics of fairy tales, I'm going to stop reading and underline it with my pencil so it can help me to remember the characteristics of fairy tales. As I begin to read the story, I notice that the story begins with Once Upon a Time. When the story begins with Once Upon a Time, that tells me that this story is a fairy tale. I'm going to stop reading and take my pencil and I'm going to underline Once Upon a Time because that is a characteristic of a fairy tale. All right, now I'm going to keep reading through the story and see if I can find another characteristic that will tell me that this is a fairy tale story. Oh, I need to stop reading. I just read about the fairy godmother. The fairy godmother is a magical character, and that tells me that this story is a fairy tale. A characteristic of fairy tales is they have magical characters in their stories. I'm going to take my pencil and underline fairy godmother. All right, now I'm going to go back to reading the story. Let me see if I can find another characteristic that can tell me that this story is a fairy tale. She waved her magic wand over a pumpkin, and a regional coach appeared. I'm going to stop right here for a moment. Fairy godmother was able to turn the pumpkin into a regional coach with her wand. That sounds like magic to me. And when a magical event happens in the story, that tells me that this is a fairy tale. I'm going to underline magic wand because that is another characteristic that I found that tells me that this story is a fairy tale. Let me keep reading to see if I can find another characteristic that will let me know that this is a fairy tale. The story ends with Cinderella married the prince and lived happily ever after. When I read that the ending is and lived happily ever after, this tells me that this story is a fairy tale, and this is a characteristic of a fairy tale. I'm going to underline with my pencil and lived happily ever after. Now that I've found throughout the story different characteristics of a fairy tale, I'm going to write the characteristics that make up a fairy tale onto my English chart to help me remind me later what characteristics of a fairy tale are. At the top of my anchor chart, I'm going to write characteristic of fairy tales. Then under characteristics of fairy tales, I will write or list the characteristics that make a story a fairy tale. The characteristics of a fairy tale are story begins with once upon a time, magical characters that are part of the story, magical events that are part of the story, and the story ends with and lived happily ever after. So, what are some pictures that I can draw next to each of the different fairy tale characteristics to help with remembering each of the characteristics?